Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the well-crafted speech of the member for Streatham. And like him, I welcome the chance to debate this important issue. I must preface my remarks by declaring, in the interest of transparency, that I also used to work in the industry, but on both sides of the regulatory fence, as a regulator in policy and supervision roles, and also within the insurance and banking sector prior to coming into the House. The depth of anger, Mr. Speaker, felt by our constituents, I feel, is very much underestimated in the City and Canary Wharf. I think constituents hear the technical jargon used often in debates like this, but they're not confused by what went on. They know senior bankers made big mistakes, yet kept their massive payments. They are incredulous that the banks have returned so quickly to paying bonuses, and I think the member for Leeds East touched on that point in his remarks. And they're also frustrated, Mr. Speaker, that the rhetoric of reassurance from the banks is so often at odds with their own experience as customers, particularly around issues of treating customers fairly. Mr. Speaker, as the member for South Northamptonshire pointed out, I think the motion, dare I say it, is poorly drafted in suggesting that no action has taken place, and the member for Streatham endorsed that view from the other side of the House. There has been a flurry of regulatory initiatives, such as the more intensive supervision by the FSA following their admission of regulatory failure over Northern Rock. And indeed on derivatives, which is touched on in the motion, the Capital Requirements Directive will require funds that are not cleared through a clearing house to be subject to higher capital requirements. And so there is action taking place. And likewise, I think in the proposed amendment from the government, there was rightly a focus on the issues of structure, indeed on prudential policy, but it was silent on what I think is the key issue and the one that I want to touch on in my remarks today, which is enforcement against individuals within banks. Before doing that, though, I think I'll just touch on one further point, which is the debate so far has been silent on the short-termism that is fostered by the way pension funds are managed, and particularly the pressure that puts on chief executives who risk, if they don't add shareholder value, being fired, and also the fact that within banks, people fear missing the target set by their chief executive more than they actually fear the regulator. Of course.
It is not one of the serious issues to do with bonuses and the point my honourable friend was just making. It became a kind of call option. You could get a bonus, but you never lost out. Should it not be reformed so that you can get a bonus, but you can also get a loss as well, and that aligns you more with the return on whatever the bank is up to?
The honourable member is absolutely correct, and I will come on in my remarks, if I may, just to look at some of the quantum of fines that are being imposed, which I think make the point very strongly that he himself is making. But before doing so, can I just touch on the regulatory structure? My honourable friend, I'm sure, will talk about the changes the government is making, and those are right. I think we do need to have clarity as to who is in charge in the event of failure, and the tripartite system did not make that clear. But I'm sure he, like the last Chancellor in his white paper, will accept that there is no single institutional model to insulate us against a crisis. It's welcome clarity, but that itself is insufficient. The government is also right to focus on prudential policy. But I, again, caution about the reliance on policy itself. You only need to look, Mr. Speaker, at how often it's changed. We're already on Basel III, version 3, Solvency version 2, MiFID version 2, and the next debate in this House is on commission in the retail sector, which is an issue that's been debated for many years. To give a specific example of the flaws in new policy, let me direct the House to best execution, which was one of the features of MiFID. It required banks to shop around to obtain the best price. I'm sure it won't surprise members to discover that banks, when they did shop around, happened to find, in accordance with their written policy, that the best possible price just happened to be the one offered by their own investment banking arm. Notwithstanding, therefore, the limits of structures and policy, it's clear that a clearinghouse for derivatives would be a welcome step. I think it would be a key component in addressing the opaque financial instruments such as securitisations in the bank, which stop people getting access to the visibility that was required on the bank statements. And I think that was one of the features that made people stop lending. I think Alan Greenspan's claim that derivatives efficiently dispersed risk throughout the financial system ignore the concentration of risk in individual firms. And I think you only need to look at AIG to see the effect of that sort of concentration. A perhaps more technical point is that clearing houses should be more consistently valuing collateralisation requirements across all banks. And the reason for that is the different requirements that apply, for example, to UK and German banks in terms of their capital standards and liquidity requirements. But the most glaring issue, I feel, that needs to be addressed is this issue of enforcement, and in particular, the lack of transparency, which goes to the heart of this sentiment constituents that people have had a one-way bet, and I think that's the point that the member for Dover was alluding to. To give an example, the failure of enforcement and the lack of a taxpayer's guarantee has been material, in particular now that investment banks are not partnerships. I don't think many partnerships would have leveraged their capital up to 40 times in the way that many of the banks did. And put simply, the alignment of interest between shareholders who provide the capital and employees who allocate it is not as strong as historically was the case. And I think that's one of the features of the shadow banking system as well, where the banks had no long-term interest in the securitisations they structured and underwrote in a way that we would not allow if it was an aviation company or a pharmaceuticals company for them to design products they expected to fail and to get profit from that in the way that Goldman Sachs did in terms of the Abacus deal. In the final minute allocated to me, I just turn to the quantum of fines. To put this in context, no fine has been imposed on any senior executive in RBS, HBOS, Halifax, Lloyds or Bank of Scotland. And the biggest 3 fines applied to Northern Rock amount to less than £1 million. That's less than the chief exec earned the year before in his bonus, and the fines themselves were subject to 20 and 30% discounts from early settlement and a hardship fee. It's for that reason I feel our constituents feel that no one has been held accountable, because they've seen people walk away with the profits but not be held accountable for the things that have gone wrong. And so as my right honourable friend looks at the structure and looks at the possible, we also need to learn the lessons of why enforcement against individuals has failed.